Hi, everybody. We're just going to wait for a couple more minutes for people to enter the workshop, and then we'll begin. Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm Katie Harris from the workshop committee of the Seattle MLK Organizing Coalition. I am an older white woman with short curly gray hair and black frame glasses, and I am sitting at a friend's house in Columbia City. Before we get started, I want to mention some housekeeping details. One is that captioning is available for this workshop, and you can access it by going to the button that says CC Live Transcript. The chat will be available, but it will only work in one direction. You will be able to chat with the panelists, but not with other attendees. You won't see anything from other attendees in the chat. And that's pretty much it on housekeeping details. So we are going to get started. Reproductive rights has been key to advancing women's empowerment and equality in Cuba. Despite the 61-year-old US blockade, Cuban women have become a powerful force through the Federation of Cuban Women. Today, our panel of scholars and activists will look at reproductive justice issues through the lens of both Cuba and the US. Panelists will look at the US disinformation campaign against Cuba, and we'll also talk about how we might be able to impact US foreign policy. I'm going to turn the panel over to Cindy Domingo, who will introduce you to the workshop and to the other panelists. Cindy?
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Krista, for inviting us here to the MLK workshops. It's always a great joy to be on here, and we're honored to be able to be part of the oldest MLK celebration in the country in King County in Seattle. My name is Cindy Domingo again, and I am the chair of the U.S. Women and Cuba Collaboration and co-chair of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedoms, Cuba and the Bolivarian Alliance Issues Committee. Both of these organizations have been around for a couple of decades and are committed to building a strong women's movement to lift the 60-year-old blockade against Cuba and to normalize U.S. relations towards Cuba and other countries of the Bolivarian Alliance like Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and other countries of the Bolivarian Alliance. We want to establish U.S. foreign policy towards these countries based on a feminist leadership principles, respect for human rights as designed under the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and respect for the right of other countries' self-determination. The focus, as Katie said, of our workshop is to do some education on the issue of reproductive justice and using the example of Cuba and to understand what true reproductive justice looks like and the role it plays in the liberation of women, girls, femmes, and transgender people. We feel this is important because in the US, the Christian right wing and the Republican Party are colluding in their ongoing struggle to curtail the access to reproductive health care, with a particular focus on curtailing a woman's right to abortion and the right to choose. Secondly, the US has had a 60-year-old blockade, a 60-year-old war against Cuba, and has had an economic, cultural, social, and media blockade against Cuba that has continued to be strengthened under both the Trump administration and, unfortunately, the Biden administration. This blockade has limited our ability to have cultural and educational exchanges, to learn about the advancements of the Cuban Revolution, and in particular, the tremendous of the women and girls human rights agenda, including the rights of LGBTQ plus communities. I want to introduce our speakers, who I have known for a number of years and worked collaboratively with and in going to Cuba. Jan Strout will be our first speaker. She's the founder and leader of U.S. Women in Cuba Collaboration and has been traveling to Cuba for almost 3 decades. And I'm thankful always for her bringing me first to Cuba. She's the co-chair of the National Organization for Women's Global Feminist National Committee, and also the president of Montana chapter of NOW. Catherine Hall, leader also of the U.S. Women in Cuba Collaboration, founding director of the Birthing Project US, and for over 20 years has conducted research and programs in Cuba that looks at the system for child and maternal health, and is currently an ambassador for the Federation of International Gender and Human Rights, also known as FIRE, and is a known scholar on the Cuban health system. Moon Vasquez also has been traveling to Cuba with the U.S. Women in Cuba Collaboration for almost 2 decades, and has extensive ties with the lesbian community throughout Cuba, and co-leads our Lesbian and Allies Project. Tonight, I want to dedicate this program to 2 women who we recently lost, our dear sisters and comrades, Elisa Jarapko, a longtime U.S. activist in the Cuba Solidarity Movement, and also who came to this country during the struggle against the dictatorship in Argentina. She most recently led a campaign to try to get the Nobel Peace Prize for the Henry Reeve Brigade, which are Cuban healthcare workers who have traveled to over 42 countries over the past 2 years to fight the pandemic. The second woman I want to dedicate this program to is Georgina Herrera, a comrade in Cuba, a Cuban of African descent, a feminist, poet, and writer, and a leader in the struggle against racism and gender discrimination. Both of these women have meant so much to us, and we honor their feminist leadership. We want to say Elisa Jarapko and Georgina Herrera presente. Lastly, before we begin our speakers, I want to read a statement from the Federation of Cuban Women. And as Katie said, they represent over 80% of the women and girls in Cuba in an organization called the Federation of Cuban Women. The blockade actively blocks the use of Zoom by the Cubans, as well as blocks many other methods of communication and media. And so the only way that their voice can be heard is through our voice. And so I want to read a statement from Gretel Marante, who is the international liaison for the Federation of Cuban Women. Reading message from the FMC. The Federation of Cuban Women greets the workshop on reproductive justice as a human right, a space to debate on the legal guarantees that Cuba has provided on this matter. Our Constitution provides the protection of the rights of LGBTQ plus people with the regulation of the principle of equality and non-discrimination and the insertion of sexual orientation and gender identity as one of the causes of discrimination prescribed by law. Together with the foregoing, the modification of the current family code is imminent, a legal norm in which several of the constitutionally consecrated rights will be developed, so that sensitizing and educating the population is a social imperative aligned with the political will of the country. The national program for the advancement of women includes in Area 6, the content related to sexual and reproductive rights, promotes training for comprehensive education on sexuality in girls, boys, and adolescents, with an emphasis on education on feelings, respect for differences, strengthen the gender perspective and sexual rights in all health programs in general, and especially in sexual and reproductive health, including assisted human reproduction and those related to the anatomical change of sex. We thank the organizers and panelists of the workshop for the opportunity to speak about human rights in Cuba, a country that offers a guarantee for all without discriminatory criteria. A hug, always supportive, Federation of Cuban Women. So I forgot to actually, I want to thank the FMC for sending that statement. I forgot to describe myself as Katie had asked us. I'm a Filipino American woman with Black hair and tan skin. I am sitting in my friend's living room, so the background is muted. I have blue glasses and a good smile for all of you and a nice welcome for all of you. So thank you. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Jan Stroud, and I hope you'll stay to the end. We'll do our presentations, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and discussion. And we hope to have a short video to take a break from the talking heads before Moon Vasquez speaks. Jan, please.
Thank you, Cindy. I love to follow you, and what a beautiful opening. Presente indeed. My name in Cuba is Juanita, but I go by Jan Strout. I live in Bozeman, Montana. You'll hear a little bit about those impacts. My visual descriptions are pronouns she, ella, she and hers. I'm Anglo, white bread, in the third age stage. Some would say an old broad, but I feel as young as I will. Age is only a number. And I look best on the island of Cuba and on beaches, rivers, lakes, and hot tubs. But I am in my living room kitchen and have some mementos behind me that represent some of the political work I do in my home state, as well as nationally and globally. So my favorite question is if you've been to Cuba, please raise your hands. I can't see everyone right now, but you'll feel it. And my second is, how many of you want to travel to Cuba to see this remarkable nation, peoples, and cultures for yourself? I hope there's a lot, because you are in the right place. So why Cuba and why women? My role is to make some connections and contrasts with the status of women and reproductive justice in the United States and Cuba's advancement in these core issues for women and girls as part of their women's human rights agenda. I'd like to share a little bit of the U.S. women's human rights situation through the lens of my state, Montana. Living in the belly of the beast, and especially the bright red state of Montana, are, quote, far right to the Attila the Hun 2021 legislature, and all Montana state office holders have just passed 4 laws alone impacting negatively, directly, our human right to accessible, affordable, accurate, and available abortion services, joining Texas, Mississippi, and many other of the majority of our states in the country. And they have passed laws decimating reproductive health, sexual education, birth control, and for those who decide to have children, economic injustices around food, childcare, and housing insecurity. As we know, Roe v. Wade is hanging by a thread. On January 22nd, it will be 49 years old since that case was decided. And we also lost a major hero in the woman who fought for the case as well. We join a vast majority of states in the United States, like Montana. We will be the first state to have a so-called Born Alive ballot measure that will be on the ballot and will feel the negative voter suppression impacts this November with laws passed also by the same Attila the Hun legislature that removed our progressive voting rights from same-day voter registration and voting, and the ballot collection by those outside of your immediate family to vote by mail, that have huge limitations on Indigenous people and people with low incomes in a vast rural state of only 1 million people. And as we know, since the COVID health pandemic and economic crisis has laid bare the vast inequities and lack of social welfare and human rights impacting all women, and especially women of color, those with low incomes or in abject poverty, are homeless or living in domestic violence situations, including all those that are most underrepresented in the United States. I'll just briefly focus on a few areas going from Montana to a bit more macro of comparison on the impacts of women's lives between the US status of women and Cuba's women's rights agenda. The first is legal status and political representation of women. Nationally, women, non-binary, and all genders do not have equality in the US Constitution. That is, the Equal Rights Amendment has finally been ratified as of 2020 by the requisite 38 states, but it is not being allowed to be implemented. There'll be a big rally on January 27th, the J State, January 27th, that people can live stream, organized by our sister organization, the ERA Coalition. And as the only international women's human rights treaty, also called a Women's Human Bill of Rights, the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or our beloved CEDAW, has been ratified and implemented since 1980 by Cuba, one of the first early on, and the rest of the world, except for 4 nations, one being the United States. That treaty will take a 2/3 vote of the US Senate to be ratified by the United States. Can you imagine that during our times now? In response to CEDAW's lack of ratification by the US, there are nearly 100 cities for CEDAW working to adopt the Women's Human Rights Framework and codify it with city and county resolutions and ordinances. My Bozeman is one of them. Since ratifying CEDAW in 1980, Cuba's Federation of Cuban Women organizes a national congress every 5 years to measure the results of their plan of action to advance the status and rights of the diversity of women, based on the Beijing Platform of Action to move forward. Their highly effective grassroots organizing starts at the neighborhood level and reaches far and wide to bring recommendations and actions to their 5-year planning, and we have engaged actively with the Federation of Cuban Women on issues ranging from economic, social, political, legal, media representation, gender-based violence, marriage equality and the family code, equal pay and paid family leave, reproductive rights, with the human rights to public education from preschool through university, and comprehensive, accessible, affordable public health care that leaves no one behind. In terms of political representation, and even much fewer women of color are elected to our US Senate, and less than 25% total in both houses of Congress. Cuban women are the majority of Cuban parliament at 53%, along with a number of cabinet ministers who are female, one of the highest in the world. The majority of doctors, nurses, scientists, teachers, and most professions are women in Cuba. You and your child is learning this from the very beginning of their lives. Cuba's constitution outlaws discrimination based on gender, racial and sexual orientation, and gender expression. The FMC organizes, again, with their Casas de la Mujer y la Familia, women's centers, for women's empowerment and family education programs to prevent violence and also enhance women's economic opportunities. I can say more about their national constitutions, but I would call their foreign policy a feminist foreign policy. And of course, we can juxtapose that with the US foreign policy of militarism, world domination, endless wars, morality clauses for women and girls with the Helms Amendment, and global gag rules and more. That's why many of us are working on a feminist foreign policy, which I'd be happy to talk about later. The other two areas are ending violence against women. We're still trying to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act that has been languishing in Congress, and the international VAWA has languished since 2018. In terms of US gun violence and domestic rejected partner 99% male homicide with firearms, Montana follows Alaska as one of the highest of the overall rate. And nationally, that rate is shocking and frightening, much less children being killed at schools, and sometimes killing each other. And the never-ending murders by the US police impacting people of color and women. Breonna Taylor was hardly the first. There are so many murders of women and women of color. The Washington Post has a tracking system that started in 2015 that tracks all of the women who have been killed by police violence. Women in the US cannot imagine walking late at night home from any event, bar, or just on the Malecon, right, Mooney? It is impossible to imagine this in the United States. Guns are not allowed in Cuba, and if those few, only those who have proper legal authority. Along with gender-based violence, these are rare. There's many things about economic justice, but I want to leap to health and women's reproductive health and justice. Why spend so much time on these other areas? And again, with economic justice, we're looking at equal pay in the Constitution. 1 year's paid family leave is available to both parents. Quality, affordable childcare, and updating the family code are just some of the amazing opportunities that we are still trying to hold on to, if not accomplish, here in the United States. But why spend so much time on these other areas when the subject is reproductive justice as a human right? Because these are critical examples of how Cuba has been at the forefront of prioritizing women's and all pregnant people's decision on whether to have or not have children. And if you want to have children, these rights and resources in a reproductive justice society such as Cuba's are resourced and supported with rights of human dignity, safety, health, and education, which is all foundational to reproductive justice. A couple of other areas, and then I'll close. Along with healthcare for all, age and culturally appropriate sexual education from the young to the elderly is focused on a wide spectrum of healthy sexual practices and partners as another human right. Guided by the National Center for Sex Education, or CENISEX, Cuban women and girls have the ability to decide their bodily autonomy. The essential right to an abortion, which US women may lose by the Supreme Court any day or week now, has only two requirements. The abortion is performed by a doctor and it's in a hospital. That's it. CENISEX, led by Mariela Castro, is a visionary global model that we can only dream of in the United States, and has used its national mandates to address gender-based and all violence prevention, celebrates gender expressions and sexual orientations by ending homophobia and transphobia. The struggles for Cuban women and families are mainly from the US economic blockade, which the pandemic and economic crisis worldwide has also only made their lives, resources, and opportunities more precarious. Our US foreign policy toward Cuba is to starve them into submission and make them cry Uncle Sam to once again become one of our colonies. You'll learn more about what we are doing to change and resist this, but the US press and political misinformation is nearly as nefarious and feeds into the inhumane policy toward the Cuban people. In closing, these are some of the most resilient and defiant women I've ever had the privilege to meet and work together in solidarity. As the Cubans declare, adelante or onward, and no nos venceremos. We will never go back. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Now, Catherine, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, it's always a happy space for me when I get to be with you all and we get to share our vision of what a world would look like if we were in charge. And I think that if I were to describe myself, it always surprises me that most people, when they meet me, go, "Oh my God, you're so short. We thought you were this big, tall woman." And I don't see myself as being short, but I guess since I'm not quite 5 feet tall yet, maybe I'm just not as tall as other people. But so that's one thing. I'm a short brown skinned woman that is surrounded, as you can see, by images of women from all over the world, because in my real everyday life, I'm a midwife. And I really appreciate this opportunity. I take every opportunity I can to share what I know about Cuba, because I think that it has just been for me a place that has inspired and encouraged me to continue my quest for this thing called freedom. I'm here today representing Birthing Project USA, which is a global maternal and child health organization, IFCO Pastors for Peace, where I serve as a member of the Cuba U.S. Medical School Scholarship Program Advisory Committee, and as an ambassador for FIRE, the Federation of International Gender and Human Rights, which is a UN recognized entity. And I would like to begin by saying the name of Dr. Norma Rita Gilliard Lamonta. She, like our dear sisters, Anita and Harina, she's been my longtime colleague in Cuba, but I'm pleased to say she is still alive and engaged in her community in Havana. It's appropriate and significant that I mention her name because she and I entered into our teen years working on behalf of what we call freedom in our different countries. I am 73 years old and she's my big sister, she's 75. And we have been on this journey for a long time. Norma was one of the teenagers who participated in the Cuban literacy campaign in 1961. During the time that she was participating in the literacy campaign, I was one of the young civil rights movement kids who spent my high school years on picket lines, in jail, and registering Black people to vote in Arkansas, which is where I was born, down on the Mississippi Delta. The difference between me and Norma is at the end of her teen years, she lived in a country which embraced and claimed her as a full citizen, and I did not. I am still engaged in obtaining full citizenship because of my race, my gender, and my economic status. But over the last 21 years, she and I have grown to know each other and identify as sister friends and comrades. And we also spend a lot of time talking about the difference in the outcomes of what we participated in our coming of age years. In my role as an advisor with IFCO, Pastors for Peace, which is administering that Cuba U.S. Medical School Scholarship Program, and also being an ongoing guest faculty teaching at the Cuba School of Public Health. I teach U.S. students, health providers, and policymakers. I've gotten a bird's eye view of not only the Cuban healthcare system, but also life in Cuba. In my role as ambassador for FIRE, all of us, every single person that's engaged in FIRE acknowledges Cuba as a role model for what they are doing in terms of co-creating a country that is seriously working toward gender equity and human rights. In my skin, as an African-American woman still fighting for equality, equity, and inclusion, and control over my body and reproductive health, I am so grateful for the leadership that Cuba and the women of Cuba are providing to the rest of the world. For the last 21 years that I've been on the ground in Cuba, first to support the students and then to become a teacher, we've been able to see, and when I say we, I'm talking about the students and the providers and the policymakers in the US who are looking for a better way of improving our own public health system. We are seeing another way, not only of producing something that will work in the realm of human rights, but we're also really confronted with learning that everything that we thought about Black people is not true in Cuba. For example, we struggle in the United States with trying to figure out what to do to be inclusive in terms of education for Black and other youth of color. But Cuba has the highest literacy rate in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba also has one of the lowest rates of violence internationally. And in the space where I live, Black babies don't die 4 times more than other babies in Cuba. In fact, it turns out that Cuba is the best place on the planet for a Black baby to be born healthy and live to age 1. As a midwife and founding director of a global maternal and child health organization that is rooted in birth justice, I asked, or maybe begged, the Cuban Ministry of Health if they would teach me how they have such good birth outcomes. How could their birth outcomes be better than birth outcomes in the United States? And they have treated me the way they treat everyone else who requests help from Cuba. They have opened the doors, and I know Cuba from one end of the island to the other. And I have spent almost every day that I have been in Cuba learning and teaching the healthcare system, which is made up of every aspect of society and driven by the women of Cuba, who make up more than 70% of the national medical and research team. The last time I was in Cuba in my class, one of the newest challenges that Cuba is really coming to grips with right now is that Cuban women are deciding that maybe they should not have as many children as they want because of their ability to access the necessities that they need to care for their children, primarily because of the impact of our blockade. This blockade, and everyone knows it, but there is no way for anyone to give a presentation about Cuba without saying out loud the impact of this blockade that is intentionally set up to deny access to the critical things needed for survival, that has been voted as inhumane by the global community 29 times. And that if Dr. King was alive, he would be ashamed that we who know better, who know what it's like to both treat people inhumanely and to be on the other side of that treatment, that we know this and that we still allow this to happen in our name. Cuba has taught us in the way that they literally go about their business in the world of not only taking care of the people of Cuba, but sharing what they know and what they have access to with any other country that needs it. that we who believe in freedom actually cannot rest until it is a reality, not just for us, but for everyone. The women of Cuba continue to teach us, and in my case, teach my community and my community globally how to save our mothers and babies by demonstrating that families and neighborhoods and communities make up countries, and that countries make up the globe. And the death of Alicia has really touched me deeply because it reminds me of the power of sisterhood beyond geographic boundaries. And Norma reminds me that we have to continue to struggle, not only for our freedom, but for everyone else's freedom. But we get to define that that freedom includes inclusiveness, equity, and equality for all of us. It's not just for a few, but it's for everyone. And the women of Cuba have really set that model in terms of how that can be a part of a nation's heartbeat. And that has been the difference between the work that I did when I was a kid and the work that she did when she was a kid. But the hope and the possibility is that we are going to learn to work together to continue that struggle together for that vision for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Both you and Jan have always been such an inspiration to me and many, many others. So before I allow Moon to do her presentation, I hope I can get this video up. It was a video that was produced by the collaboration as part of a webinar that we did last year on the lesbian human rights movement in Cuba and our work with the lesbian, in particular the LGBTQI movements in Cuba, but especially the lesbian communities throughout Cuba. So I'm going to this is U.S. Women in Cuba Collaboration's YouTube channel, and we have a number of webinars and videos on that channel if you'd like to check it out. And if for some reason I can't get this to work, so.
Tras las manos va el resto de la piel. Un amor por ocultar. Aunque en cueros no hay donde esconderlo, lo disfrazan de amistad. Cuando sale a pasear por la ciudad, una opina que aquello no está bien. La otra opina que qué se le va a hacer. Y lo que opinen los demás está de más. Quien detiene palomas al vuelo, volando a ras de suelo, mujer contra mujer. No estoy yo por la labor de tirarles la primera piedra. Si equivoco la ocasión y las hallo labio a labio en el salón, ni siquiera me atrevería a toser. Si no gusto, ya sé lo que hay que hacer. Que con mis piedras hacen ella su pared. Quien te tiene opinen los demás está de más. Quien detiene palomas al vuelo, volando a ras de suelo, mujer contra mujer. Oh, oh, oh. Quien detiene palomas al vuelo, volando a ras de suelo, mujer contra mujer.
I want to thank Deb Goldman for her production of that video. And if you would like, again, if you would like to see the webinar that was produced, you can check it out on our YouTube. So Moon, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. That video is always, it gets me really emotional. We've been around the Cubans I have for the last couple of decades. And in the progression of starting this project, I see how much older we've gotten and what a strong tie we have with the women and the lesbians and the LGBTQ community in Cuba. It's amazing. I am of Puerto Rican descent. I have an olive tone on my skin. I have curly hair. It was black, and now it's a combination of you all know. I'm the youngest of 5. I'm the first generation here. Both my parents were born in Puerto Rico. I currently am in Chicago. I am a community organizer. Years ago, one of the organizings that I did was lesbian outreach for underserved and women that were living on the streets to get them to get pap smears and mammograms. And that was an eye-opener, taught me a lot. I am a carpenter and an electrician by trade. One of my passions is feral cat trap and release, and to get them neutered and spaded, which really one of the things that drives my passion is spay and neuter of cats, and not so much dogs, but somebody else is picking that work up too and stuff. So it is my pleasure to be here and to share with you this information about the collaborations, lesbian and allied work. Our project began in 2012, growing over the years, forging alliances and building between the nation of Cuba and the US, building bridges and developing strategies to support lesbian rights and the fight against homophobia through education. Our work, the work that we share is personal. It is strategic. We work for equality. And in that whole concept, we celebrate our victories. We talk about the challenges, the historical and current realities in both countries. We share knowledge and solidarity together around the joys and the struggles of life as LGBTQ women. We recognize our similarities and challenges in so many ways. In 2014, the collaboration hosted a groundbreaking forum at El Mojunje in Santa Clara, Cuba. This cultural center for more than 30 years has been a safe haven for the LGBT population in that country. That meeting drew leaders and members from 8 provinces, including the that year's US-Cuba collaborations delegation. That day was amazing. It was groundbreaking. It brought so much joy to everybody. The room was filled. People, we were all very high from that experience, and that day, it was one of the launchings of this incredible project that we are working on right now and continue to work on. In June of 2016, we hosted our first lesbian and allied US national speaking tour of Cuban lesbian activist Isabel Acosta, founder and coordinator of Las Isabelas in Santiago de Cuba. She spent more than 2 months in the US presenting and being hosted in cities across the country. Finishing her tour with the collaboration, Isabel had the honor to represent Cuba's LGBT community, traveling with IFCO, Pastors for Peace Caravan, for 12 days along the West Coast, presenting their work and then heading back to Cuba with the caravan. At the Che Guevara conference in Vancouver, BC, in 2017, Building Revolution Across Borders, our group represented and presented with the lesbians and bisexual women from Cuba and Canada, resulting in the publication in a Canadian magazine, Fire This Time. In a time of pandemic, we ask ourselves, what are we doing? With travel restriction and healthcare being two of the main, and three of the main concerns, including the pandemic, our answer is that the strongest allies that we have right now is sharing information. Here in the US, we are committed to showcasing Cuba's work and accomplishment in the LGBT community. Cuba's lawmakers in December of 2021 approved a draft of the new family code that could pave the way for marriage rights for same-sex couples in the country. Their National Assembly approved the proposal, and it states it would protect all expressions of family diversity and each person's right to build a family coherency. I have a really hard time with that word. I've practiced it, man. It is, okay. With the Cuban Constitution and its principle of equality, non-discrimination, and human dignity. Same-sex marriage is not a done deal in Cuba. The draft of this new family code will be taken to popular population for discussion and review. Those conversations will start February 1st and go through April 30th. I have a link to a really good article in the Washington Blade. I'm not sure how to share it, so maybe we can deal with this a little bit later. I know that there was a panel discussion about it, and we can't. I don't know. So we're gonna work on that, hopefully before the end of this presentation. Working in advancements in Cuba, national levels, trainings, workshops, and conferences on issues of gender and sexuality are a norm in Cuba. Forums and conversations on issues of vital importance helps Cubans' LGBTQ population feel empowered, as do national trainings on how to detect and eliminate the difference of the violence that exists. Other programs focus on safeguard of health and mainstreaming the LGBT population into the economy, the art, and professions, giving trainings and knowledge of law legal norms, and how to exercise all the rights as citizens. Here in the United States, in general, and I'm talking about in general, when talking about reproductive rights and discrimination, all too often lesbian women's issues are excluded from those discussions. And although I did not directly address those challenges, maybe on the next panel I will. I continue to learn so much from my friends and allies in Cuba. As others on this panel discuss, the biggest challenge of bridge building with Cuba has been the 61-year-old financial blockade that the US imposes on Cuba. And the newest challenge is, of course, the COVID pandemic. We are committed as an organization and as individuals to continue our solidarity with the people of Cuba and the advancement of the Cuban Revolution. And as our dear colleague and friend, Gritel from the FNC said in her statement that opened our panel, we thank the organizers and the panelists for the opportunity to speak about Cuba, a country that offers a guaranteed life for all without discriminatory criteria. In closing, I would like to share 3 quotes from 3 lesbian women that have been a member of this project since the inception. The collaboration for our Phoenix project in Cienfuegos means a lot to us. It straightens the ties of sisterhood between the women of both countries. It facilitates meetings between old friends and new ones that are formed on each trip to Cuba. Each meeting means a bond of sisterhood, a bond that is consolidated and which empowers us. We treasure their visits. Each time they come to Cuba to show solidarity with our causes and their collaboration, it is very encouraging. Olympia Diaz Borges, founder and coordinator of Phoenix. Cuban women saved from the War of Independence to the triumph of the revolution. If you humanize the combative woman, the heroines as a human being, you have, the heroines as human beings who have suffered and who have conflicts and loved, she will triumph. Liana Filbur Lopez, coordinator of Phoenix in Cienfuegos. Building community and sisterhood with lesbians and bisexual women of Cuba has been a dream come true. Another world is possible. And in the dawn of the morning silence, you can hear the phoenix rise and the warrior Calcaboo of Trinidad raise her sword and continue her battle for equal rights. Luna, founder of the Lesbian Ally Project. May we forever celebrate the great Dr. Martin Luther King. We shall overcome. Thank you for sharing this time with us.
Thank you, Moon. Thanks. Thank you, Moon, Catherine, and Juanita, as we call Jan when we go to Cuba, but also now. So as you can see, these 3 women, as members of the U.S. Women in Cuba collaboration, are some of the utmost experts on the human rights advancements of women in Cuba. So I'd like to open it up if there are any questions. I don't know, Katie, if we don't see any in the Q&A or in the chat. If there's any discussion or questions and answers, we'd be willing to take them. Until I see them, I'm gonna just briefly, please feel free to put them in there so we can take them up. And so since we have some time, I just want to, this is always about action. Dr. Martin Luther King stated that, we need to do education, and that's the theme of this MLK celebration this year. And well, here's a question. What makes Cuba so unique to mobilize their communities to do the work that they do? So I'll open that up if anyone wants to answer that. Go ahead, Catherine.
From my perspective, one of the things that makes them so unique is that people primarily work in the communities where they live. And there's not a class difference. For example, the majority of the doctors are women because there is no advantage financially. There's no advantage in terms of social stratification or whatever. So people who choose to be doctors do it because they want to be doctors. That's the main reason. And I think that one of the best examples of that would be when you're the doctor who happens to be a woman who was voted like the best primary care doctor in the region. And she happened to live in Cuba. What she inherited with that great recognition was she got to live in one of the communities that was not doing the best medically. And so she literally, because she was the best doctor, lived in her new community, became a community that needed a more aggressive interventions. And so she lives there, she works there. That was her reward for being the best, is having the most challenging versus getting more money, getting a car, getting a house. So that was a foreign concept to me as a person from the US, seeing how people live and work in their own communities and why they do that.
Dan or Moon, do you want to address that question?
I'd like to add to it. So in Cuba, whenever anything happens, say like in my presentation, I was talking about gay marriage, the same-sex marriage, and how they're going to take it to the popular population. So in every decision that goes into the Constitution, it goes from every level. They start with the neighborhood, the block you live on. People come together, they speak to each other, they give their opinions. Then the next process is they go into the neighborhood range of the same discussion, and then they take their time, they listen to people have an opinion. From there, it keeps growing. Then it goes to the provincial level. Then it goes to the national level. So everybody's voices is heard. And when you give people that kind of mobility, it's an ownership. So it starts from the grassroots, the literally grassroots, and goes from there, and it grows back to the national and to the state. And so it is one of the things that we don't know, because we really live in isolation from our neighbors. We don't know their names, let alone to sit down and speak with how to mobilize issues within our community. It's quite amazing just to see and to continue to see that year and year and year after year that they do take the mobility of people and their opinions to the state level.
Dan?
I would just build on these great answers because I love the question so much. The role I play in my own organizing is organizing mostly around women's human rights and addressing a variety of the issues I touched briefly on. And the question Catherine has brought up so many times, I adore, which is really, why don't we have a federation of US women in this country? And part of it, I think, is we have such a fractured, individualistic, ethnocentric notion of ourselves and our country. It makes it very hard, as one who does this work, along with so many of us in a variety of sectors, to be able to find that common ground and to really leave your egos at the door, not to fight over resources and look at, the mentality of scarcity in the richest country of the world, and so on. And so we've got a lot of internal oppression. We have external, forms of oppression. And I think that Cuba's worked so hard and continues to work so hard on all of these. They don't have the money, as Catherine talked about, in terms of glamorous careers, but it's about the labor of love and the fact that hope and love and compassion are so fundamental as national values that, nobody's perfect. They're not perfect. We are told that every time we're with them, but they really have focused on those things and finding out what unites them and not so much which divides them. And I think those are the other building blocks that have already been eloquently stated.
Thank you.
I just want to say one more thing before we move on, because this is my favorite Cuba statement with, from the reproductive health standpoint. One of the things that we say is that the majority of babies born in the US were not born by choice. And in Cuba, we say every baby is a wanted baby, because at the point that a woman finds out she's pregnant, she also makes a decision as to whether or not she wants to continue to be pregnant. And what Cuba says is that, but every time a woman chooses an abortion, it is a failure on the part of Cuba, because they must not have educated this woman correctly, or she didn't have access to what she needed to protect herself. Because if the system is working well, then every woman should have so much self-esteem and be so aware of her options that she would never expose herself to unprotected sex. That is just such a flip of the paradigm in terms of each woman having what she needs to make informed decisions about what's going to happen with her body.
Thank you. So there are a couple questions about essentially what we can do. One is the question about delegations. The other one is about congressional action. And so that's essentially part of the actions you can take. So in terms of changing US foreign policy, yes, lobbying the president as well as Congress is so important, because they are the ones that have to change the US foreign policy. But we know that it won't happen without undue pressure from all of us. When Joe Biden was running for president, he promised that he would change US foreign policy and essentially go back to the policies that President Obama had implemented, which was beginning to normalize relations with Cuba by opening up travel and trade. However, Joe Biden has chosen to reinforce the 243 measures that President Trump implemented that harshened the blockade. And in fact, Joe Biden has not only gone back on his promise, but has kept the Trump administration's policies in place and has continued to add more money to supporting anti-government demonstrations and movements, especially in the Afro-Cuban communities and the artist communities in Cuba. And that money is funneled through USAID monies. And so we need to let Biden know that he needs to keep his campaign promise, that these are about human lives, especially under the pandemic, because the blockade at this point really curtails a lot of the travel that had been opened up by the Obama administration. And during this period of the pandemic, Cuban families need to know the status of their families and need to be able to support their families through sending of money, sending of goods that the blockade has only curtailed. As a result of the blockade, Western Union offices have been closed down, and so it is very, very difficult, almost impossible to send money to Cuban families from their families abroad. So write to President Biden, call the White House, and let them know that they need to normalize relations with Cuba. And at least at this point, go back to the Obama administration policies of beginning to normalize, to rescind the Trump administration measures, and to begin to reopen up travel and trade with Cuba. We also need to, because it is an act of Congress that must be taken to lift the blockade. So we need to write to our congressional delegation, our senators, and House representatives and urge them to implement a policy of re-engagement of ties with Cuba. Recently, 114 House representatives signed a letter to Biden asking him to begin the re-engagement process, to rescind the 243 measures by the Trump administration and reopen travel. Fortunately, I know in Washington State that 4 of our representatives signed that letter. And so if you live in the districts of Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, Adam Smith, can't remember the other 2, the congressman from up north, up in Snohomish County, and the last one, sorry, I can't remember, but there were 4. You can go on the website of ACERI, a new legislative lobbying organization. It's www.acere.org. And you can follow along any congressional lobbying that is being done around US foreign policy towards Cuba. In terms of traveling to Cuba, there is travel going on even in light of the pandemic. What we didn't mention is that Cuba developed on its own, because it has such a robust biotech industry, developed 5 vaccines on their own. And 3 of them have been fully utilized in Cuba. And they have pretty much almost, I think they are one of 2 countries in the world that have the highest vaccination rates in the world. Almost 99.9% of their population from ages 2 years old on up have been vaccinated. And they are getting ready to administer boosters as well. And they have broken in terms of the vaccination. They have given vaccines to other developing countries that have not been able to access vaccines because of the monopoly on vaccines. And so Cuba is making available free of charge vaccinations or for little payment for countries that can't afford to pay. So in the fight against the pandemic, a small country like Cuba has played an international role in fighting the pandemic in spite of the 61-year-old blockade. But you can travel to Cuba. Although the Omicron Omicron variant has hit Cuba, so they are being careful again about testing, seeing that people are vaccinated before they're allowed to enter into the country. But you can travel with, if you want to go on an organized trip, which is pretty much an educational trip, is pretty much the way that you have to go. There are no more individual trips based off of pleasure or cruises, and there are limited numbers of flights given the pandemic, but the Venceremos Brigade, which usually sends an annual delegation, will be traveling in July. Pastors for Peace has just announced their trip that also will be happening in July. Catherine Hall Trujillo also brings educational trips, and she already has organized one march and which studies the healthcare system and especially delivery of services to maternal and children services. But there are still groups going to Cuba. Someone asked about U.S. Women in Cuba collaboration. We used to do an annual delegation, and we are so eager to go back to Cuba. But we also are careful because of the pandemic, and we're hoping to either have a delegation this fall or maybe early next year. And again, we focus on the advancement of women's human rights. And we do our trip in coordination with the Federation of Cuban Women so that you are exposed to many women and lesbian movements in terms of so that you can have a great educational time as well as a great recreational time. You know, that's some of the questions, answering the questions. I don't know if there's any more. Anybody else want to add anything? Okay.
I would just only say that the joy of, I think, going on a delegation, besides getting to experience from multiple perspectives Cuba and the different themes and topics, is that we also really ask people to come back and make commitments to working toward educating and helping people understand the myths and realities of Cuba, Cuban women, the revolution, and to do that in whatever way feels most comfortable for them. We provide a lot of resources in that way. We've been focused, of course, on the virtual educational and organizing worlds, but I think for almost everyone, when you come back, you really want to do something about this incredibly insane foreign policy that we have, and the real hardships that you'll see in Cuba because of so much that we have done, that Cindy has outlined so well. So we have, I think, a commitment to prepare people to go through discussions and readings and opportunities to come and be as socially responsible of a traveler that we can be. And we're really there in solidarity with the Cuban people. That's what our work is about.
And I think I have to turn it over to Katie. She wants to close this out. But thank you all for attending. And I think Katie will be following up and sending out some of these actions.
Yes, thank you, Cindy. I have just put in the chat a couple of links. One is for tomorrow's workshops. We still have 3 more workshops in our community workshop series, and we welcome you to sign up for those. And we also ask that you evaluate this workshop. It's very important for our future planning. Thank you so much to our panel. We really appreciate your time. Oh, I also want to mention that we'll be sending out resources from the panelists in a follow-up email to you. So this concludes our presentation. Thank you all so much for coming and for speaking. And I hope we see you tomorrow at more workshops. Good night.
Thank you, Katie and Krista.
Thanks so
Bye,
much.
ladies.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Uh-huh.